friends, welcome. Today in this class we will talk about the concept of the fundamentals of economic, that is the excess demand and the deficient demand. In these you will understand the meaning and the concept of excess and the deficient demand, then the reasons or the causes for the same, and what are the impacts of the excess and deficient demand on output, employment and general price level. Okay, so let's start with what is the excess demand. Okay, let's first understand the meaning and the concept of the excess demand. Before going to understand the excess demand, there is a term that we need to understand first, that is the aggregate demand, and the next one is the aggregate supply. Okay, aggregate demand is denoted as AB and aggregate supply is denoted as AS. Okay, aggregate demand is a total demand for the goods and the services which all buyers including the consumers, firms or the businesses, governments, foreigners, etc. Are ready to buy at a given price level at a given period of time. So that is known as the aggregate demand. Whereas aggregate supply is the total supply of the goods and the services which all the sellers are ready to sell at a given price level, okay, and at a given period. Okay. So now let's understand the definition, the meaning of the excess demand. Okay. So the excess demand is a situation when the aggregate demand is higher than the aggregate supply and it is corresponding to the full employment level of output in the economy. Okay. When we have the full employment level of output in the economy and the aggregate demand is exceeding the aggregate supply, the situation is called excess demand. Okay. In the other word, we can say that the excess of anticipated expenditure over the full employment equilibrium or the full employment level of output. Okay. So that is known as the excess demand. Excess demand leads inflationary gap. Okay. Over here the inflation is a situation when the price for the goods and the services is continuously increasing and therefore the consumers end up getting less quantity of output while paying the more for that. Okay. So that is inflation. Okay, and inflationary gap, excess demand leads inflationary gap, that is a gap, okay, when the actual aggregate demand, okay, the actual aggregate demand that is higher than the aggregate demand that is required to establish the full employment equilibrium. Okay. So that is known as the inflationary gap. And if the inflationary gap is larger, okay, then we have the greater pressure on the economy because the price of the goods and the services are very high. Okay. So it leads inflationary gap. Let's understand this excess demand with the help of a graph. Okay. Here let's draw a graph. On the x-axis we have the income, output and employment. Okay. And on the y-axis we have the aggregate demand. Okay. So now we have the 45-degree curve that shows the income. Okay. That shows the income or the aggregate supply curve. You can say it aggregate supply curve. Okay. And the other, that is the aggregate demand curve. We have the aggregate demand curve over here. Okay. So this is our aggregate demand curve. So when we have the full employment equilibrium, So when the aggregate demand intersects aggregate supply, then we have the full employment equilibrium level. Okay, it is intersecting at this point. It is marked with the red color. Okay, it is over here. But our actual aggregate demand is at this point. Okay. This is our actual aggregate demand curve. Okay. So our actual aggregate demand curve, actual aggregate demand is at this point. Okay. Whereas the anticipated or the aggregate demand that is required to establish the full equilibrium, full employment equilibrium is at this point. Okay. So this will be our inflationary gap. It is known as the inflationary gap. This is our actual aggregate demand, whereas this is anticipated aggregate demand that is required to establish the full employment equilibrium. Okay, it is the equilibrium point. So this is the graph showing the excess demand. This is our excess demand. Okay. Now we have understand the concept of the aggregate demand. Okay. But what are the reasons for the excess demand? Let's understand the various reasons for the excess demand. Okay. Generally, the reasons or the causes of the excess demand is the change in the component of aggregate demand. The component of aggregate demand are the consumption, investment, or the government spendings, or the net exports. Okay, and these all are the component of the aggregate demand. When there is any change in the component of the aggregate demand, we have the excess demand that will cause the excess demand. Let's understand it in detail. Let's say the rise in the propensity to consume. Okay, over here the propensity to consume means the proportion of income that is spent on the goods and the services. That is known as the propensity to consume. It is the ability of the consumer to spend on goods and services. Okay. If the income for consumer will rise, the propensity to consume will increase, and therefore the demand for the product will increase, and that will lead to increase in the aggregate demand. And when there is increase in the aggregate demand, that will cause the excess demand. Okay. The next reason for the excess demand is the rise in or the increase in the disposable income. Okay. Disposable income is the income which the consumer are at the end able to spend. Okay. Whatever the income consumer have, they are not able to spend whole of that income. Okay, they have to pay tax from that income, and when tax is deducted from their income, whatever the income remain is known as the disposable income. Okay, so when there is a reduction in tax rates or the tax, okay, if the tax is reduced, then the disposable income of the person will increase, and as they are having more income, they spend more on goods and services, they demand more goods, and that will lead the excess demand. Okay. Then another reason for this is increase in investment. Okay. If there is a ready credit facility, credits are easily available, then and the credit rates are the rate of interest is very less, then the consumer having more income with them because they borrow more fund from the banks or the other institution at a lower rate. Okay, therefore they are having more income and they are able to spend more amount on goods and services. That will cause the excess demand. Okay. The another reason is the increase in the government spendings. Okay. when the government do the more public expenditure or they demand more goods and services from the country, from the other private or the public institution, then also the demand will increase and causes the excess demand. Okay? Or if the increase in the increase in the exports, if the price, that is the domestic price of the goods and the services in the country is lesser, then the more goods are demanded from outside also, therefore the export will increase, okay, and therefore it will lead to the more aggregate demand, okay, that will cause the excess demand and decrease in the import. If the goods and services are available at a higher price in the international market, then the consumer will buy it from a domestic market. Therefore, the demand in the domestic market will increase and causes the excess demand. So, these all are the causes for the excess demand. Now, let's understand what is the impact of excess demand on the output, on the employment, and on the general price level of the economy. Okay? When there is excess demand, okay, here it is the impact of the excess demand. When the excess demand, we have the excess demand, there is no impact on the output because the country, the economy is already running at the full employment. There is no idle capacity. Okay, and as there is no idle capacity, we can't increase the output. Okay, and therefore the output do not have any impact of the excess demand. Okay, the same way there is no involuntary unemployment existence in the economy. Okay, and therefore it will also not have any impact on the employment level also. Okay, and what are the impact on the price level? Okay, price levels will rise. The goods and services will available at at a higher price. Why? Because the aggregate demand is higher. Okay, demand is higher than the supply. When the supply is lesser and the demand is higher, obviously the price will rise, and that will cause a lot to the economy. Okay, so this is about the excess demand. Okay, now let's start with the deficient demand. Okay, we have understand the excess demand till now. Now move on to the next topic, that is the deficient demand. Okay, what is the meaning of the deficient demand? It is opposite to the excess demand. Okay, so when the aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment level of output, okay, in the economy, the situation when the aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply is known as the deficient demand. Over here, the planned aggregate demand shorts the aggregate supply that is necessary for the full employment equilibrium. Okay? Your deficient demand leads deflationary gap. Okay. Deflation is a situation when the price for the goods and services is continuously decreasing. Okay, and it will also harm to the economy. So what is the deflationary gap? So it is a gap when the actual aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply that is necessary to establish the full employment equilibrium. Okay, so the actual aggregate demand is less than the aggregate supply. Let's understand it with the help of a graph. here we have a graph, or the same way we have understand for the excess demand. On the x-axis we have the income, employment, and the output level shows on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the aggregate supply. Okay, sorry, aggregate demand. This is our income curve at the 45 degree. Okay, denoted as Y, or the AS curve, also known as AS curve. Okay, and this is our aggregate demand. Okay, where we have the full employment equilibrium. Okay, it is a situation where we have the full employment equilibrium. Okay, but our actual demand curve is at this point. Okay, actual demand curve is at this point, and therefore our demand is over here. Okay, but the actual the demand that need to create the full employment equilibrium is over here. Okay, so this gap is known as the deflationary gap. Okay, and that will lead to the deficient demand. Here we have the less demand than the anticipated. That's why it is known as the deficient demand. Whereas this is a full employment equilibrium point. Okay. So we have understand the concept of the deficient demand. Now let's understand the reasons, various reasons for that causes the deficient demand. Okay. The same way, the reasons for the deficient demand is also the change in the components of the aggregate demand. Okay, change in the component of aggregate demand. Okay. Let's say one of the reason of it is decrease in the propensity to consume. When the consumer having less income, they are not able to spend. Okay, and their propensity to consume will decrease. Okay, and therefore they will spend less amount for buying goods and services. That will cause the deficient demand. Okay, or the decrease in the disposable income. That means the tax will increase in, and therefore the consumer having less income for spending to consume on goods and services, and as they are having less income, they are not able to spend more on goods and services, and therefore they will demand less amount of goods. Okay, that will cause the deficient demand. Okay, the another reason for this is the decrease in investment. Okay, there is no readily available credit facility, or the increase in the rate of interest that will give the funds to the investors or the firms or the businesses at a very higher rate. That will give a lesser return to the businessman. So they will not borrow the money from the banks or the other institution. Okay, and they will not also consume. They will not spend the money, and they do not demand the goods or the services. That will cause the deficient demand. Okay, when the government spendings on the goods and the services will decrease, then also we have the lesser demand for the goods and services, and that will lead to the deficient demand. Okay, and if the imports will increase, okay, then the demand, the goods and services is demanded from the outside countries, international market, okay, and not from the domestic market. Then also the demand in the domestic market is less, okay, or else the export is lesser. Okay, exports will decrease. If the price of a goods and services in a domestic market is higher, then no one from the outsider demand that goods. Okay, and therefore also the demand, aggregate demand is less and causes a deficient demand. Okay, so these all are the reasons for the deficient demand. Now understand the impact of a deficient demand. Okay, impact on the, let's say, impact on the output. Okay, here the economy are running at a full employment equilibrium level. Okay, and therefore, but they are running at a full employment equilibrium level, but the demand is lesser. Okay, demand is lesser, demand is decreasing continuously. Okay, therefore the firm having more inventory stock because the production is high and demand is less. Okay, so in the future they would not like to do more production, so the production will decrease. Okay, so that will lead to the fall in output in the future. Okay, its impact on the employment. Okay, as the firm would like to decrease the production and the economy is running at a full employment and they are decreasing their output, they would the involuntary employment will decrease. Involuntary unemployment will decrease. Okay, because the firms do not want more production. Okay, and the price of the goods and services will decline. The demand is lesser and the supply is higher. The supplier must need to decrease the price for the goods and the services. Okay, so it has a very negative impact on these all the 3 points. Okay, so this is about the excess demand and the deficient demand. I hope the concept is clear with you. In the next class, we will talk about the investment multiplier. So stay tuned for that.